presence. Presence. Presence is a really cool thing. Now, I'm not talking about presents, those things that you wrap up and give for Christmas presents or birthday presents. Those are cool too, but it's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about that sense of someone in your life. Presence. You with me? All right? Wow, you're already gone. No, all right. So the reality is that's what we want to talk about. And presence is really something pretty cool. I'm hoping that you have someone in your life that their presence means something to you, that brings comfort to you, that brings inspiration to you, that their presence tangibly makes a difference in your life. Because presence is a powerful thing. In fact, if you Google presence, which I did this week, right? There's article after article on presence in parenting. Like we need to be present for our kids, right? Presence in parenting. Presence in leadership. Presence in managing. Presence in meditation, and on and on and on. There's just all kinds of different ways in which presence seems to be something that is powerful. I can remember personally, right, numerous instances when the presence of my parents made a huge difference in my life, right? So whether a time of fear, a time of uncertainty, a time, yes, Mom, she's watching. The reality of her presence, my dad's presence, right, was important tangibly in my life. In fact, if I'm really honest, at 57, I still need my mommy once in a while, right? You with me? Right? Presence is important. I can remember my brother and sister are much, much older than me. He's not even here to appreciate it, Deb, I know. My brothers are much older than me. But here's what that meant, that I was a young kid as they were up in college age. And I can remember being so excited for them to come home on a weekend, or me to go to Westminster College on a weekend, or them to come home for the summer, because their presence meant something to me. You catching the gist? My girlfriend of 6 years, right? For Denise and I, we're now married. Just thought I'd clarify that. So my girlfriend of 6 years, right? When we were dating, we were at different colleges. And so our only place of communication on most weeks was the payphone in the lobby of my dorm. Now, some of you need to ask someone older what a payphone is later in the service, right? There was a day when a phone was like connected to a wall, and you had to like put coins in to talk in it. It's crazy, I know. But the reality is that was our own. So when we had that opportunity to see each other, that presence was really good. And still to this day, after almost 36 years of marriage, the room changes, right, by virtue of her presence in it. This week I've been struggling with a cold. Her presence to bring me tea and take care of me and spoil me has been awesome, right? You understand. I hope that you have someone in your life, a spouse, a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, a coworker, a mentor, someone in your life that their presence means something to you. Well, presence is a powerful thing in our lives because presence is a big deal in the Bible. We've talked about this before. A year ago, actually, just a year ago, we did this whole thing on the tabernacle and the temple. And we went all the way back to Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve in the garden before sin, they walked freely in the what? Presence of God, right? So without any encumbrance to the reality of the presence of God. And that's a reality that we can't even begin to imagine now because that presence was interrupted and taken away by sin. But the story of the Bible is how God is restoring his presence. We see that in veiled ways throughout the Bible. The tabernacle was one, the temple was one, the prophets are one, and especially in Jesus, right, whom John told us back in chapter 1, came and dwelt or tabernacled among us. Jesus was God with us, presence. And it all ultimately points to a day when we will once again dwell in the perfect presence of God. In the Garden of Eden will be restored forever. Great day. It is not wrong, ladies and gentlemen, to say that a major theme, maybe even the greatest theme of the Bible, is this presence of God. Tim Keller, I'll just give you a good Keller quote, right? Tim Keller has rightly said, "To stand in the presence of God, that is what the gospel is. The gospel is not primarily about forgiveness. It's not primarily about feelings. It's not primarily about power. All those things are byproducts, sparks. It's primarily, says Keller, the gospel is primarily about the presence of God. I don't know, maybe you sense that today. Maybe you desire that today, to find ways to be closer to God, to be in his presence. Well, this is the place in which the disciples are in John 14. And quite frankly, it's why in John 14 the disciples are freaking out, right? They've walked with this amazing man, Jesus, whom they eventually know to be the Son of God, the very presence of God, and now he is telling them that he is going away. And he's telling them that they cannot go with him. And their fear creates a really amazing teaching conversation between Jesus and the disciples in John 14. And hopefully you remember what Jesus said last week at the very start of that conversation. So here they are. Jesus has told them, I'm going away. You can't come with me. The reality is that is like, so their presence, his presence has been so important to them that they begin to get a bit anxious. And Jesus says right out of the chute in this conversation, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. Then he goes on to say, listen, I am going away, but I'm going to prepare a place for you, a home for you. And I'm going to come back, and I'm going to bring you to that place, and that's where we're going to be forever. It's a great reassurance of his future presence with them. And don't miss the power of that future presence. But there's a gap, isn't there? There's a gap that's left in simply a future presence. I mean, what might be on the disciples' minds? Maybe on our minds today as Jesus talks about a future presence of heaven. What about now? Jesus, are you at all present now? It's kind of like the feeling that we have when a great Christian saint in our lives breathes his last. I remember this and being at my dad's bedside in the midst of his last moments, knowing that I'll see him again in heaven, but also knowing that walking away from that bed meant that this huge gap would be in my life, right? You get that. That I know there is this day coming, but what about now? I have to think that that's how the disciples felt as Jesus talks to them about leaving them. But yeah, there's rooms in heaven. That's great, Jesus, but what about right now? Well, that's the subject of the second half of John 14. And so I pray that as we work our way through these truths for the disciples from the mouth of Jesus, that we might find in it comfort as well. Because John 14 is all about Jesus revealing himself as comfort. Comfort to a troubled group of guys who are very worried about the absence of Jesus. And here he brings comfort by revealing his plan, ready, for his presence now. Not just a future presence, but a presence now. So as we head in, let me ask, do you ever wonder about the presence of God in your life? The presence of God in your struggles? Maybe feeling, maybe fearing his absence? Well, if that's true, you're in the right place this morning. Because we join the disciples in that very place, but in a place in which Jesus explains the promise of his presence now. John chapter 14, we're going to start in verse 15. It's page 901 in your pew Bibles. 901 in your pew Bibles. Be turning there. John chapter 14, and we'll be starting in verse 15. Give you a moment to turn there. The first thing I want us to see this morning is in verses 15 through 17. We're going to take it in chunks this morning. In verses 15 through 17, and see the design of the promise of presence. Here's the very words of Christ as he speaks to his disciples, as he speaks to us today. If you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. At first glance, verses 15 through 17 may seem like Jesus is saying, hey, love me and do everything that I will tell you, and then I will send the Holy Spirit. A deal that if we somehow do our part, he will do his. But is that really what it says? Is that really something that the Bible teaches? We need to use the rest of the Bible to help us interpret and understand what Jesus is saying here. And without being too technical this morning, I'm going to give you the answer. That's not what it's saying. Jesus is not setting out, listen, a kind of linear to-do list here as much as he's revealing a three-dimensional invitation or a three-dimensional design of what it means to experience the presence of God. Understand the difference? Right? There's this, which in American culture, we do this often, right? Even just in the reality of the world we live, we think linearly. We think if I do this and I do this, then I will get this. And in this verse, it might be seemingly that if I love God and I do what he says, then he'll show up, right? And many of us live our lives that way. That is not what this is saying. In fact, what it is saying is more quasi-matrix, three-dimensional, right? In the reality that as the design of God, the design that God has made, that is as we love him and as we obey his commands, it's actually stepping into an invitation, stepping into a place where we'll experience God and we'll experience his presence. It's like he's set it up and then he invites us in. It's not conditional. It's experiential. Jesus is telling us, this is how my presence will work. As you seek to love me, and when you obey the things that I've laid out for you, you will discover my presence. And notice that he tells it to us two more times. We'll skip ahead in the readings. Look at verse 21. It's so important, this design of his presence, that he keeps repeating it. In verse 21, he says, whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. In verse 23, Jesus answered, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. These are significant promises, and promises that fit a design, not a linear, you got to do this, suck it up, buttercup. It's the reality of an invitation to a place in which he is designed to reveal his presence, and where he's going to reveal his presence is in our love for him and our obedience to his command. Jesus is saying, I want an ongoing relationship with you, and here is how that works. You've experienced that, right? I mean, when in your life have you experienced the presence of God most strongly? Is it when you're running away from God or running to God? When have you experienced the presence of God more strongly? When you're walking in obedience to his word, or when you're walking in disobedience to his word? Listen, the only presence I get when I'm walking away from his love or disobeying his word is the 2x4 that hits me in the head and turns me around and go the other way, right? You with me? And so he's saying, listen, you've experienced this. You know this to be true. That when you love me, as you obey my commands, you will experience my presence. Well, you say that still seems to put a lot of pressure on me. Feels a little linear to me still, Pastor Rick. Well, these opening verses of design help us out, because look at verses 16 and 17 and it changes everything. And see now another dimension to this three-dimensional presence of God that influences us even to our core. What does Jesus promise? Jesus promises to ask the Father, and he will give you another helper. Some Greek here. Anybody interested in Greek today? Here we go. A little bit of Greek. The Greek here for another actually means one like myself. So get what Jesus is saying. The one that is coming, whom I'm asking the Father for, whom God is sending, Jesus says to the disciples, is what? Just like me. So I'm leaving, yes, tangibly, I'm going, But the reality is that I'm going to ask the Father, and the Father is going to send one just like me. And the Greek here for helper is a complex Greek word. In fact, let's practice it. It's parakletos. Can you say it? Oh, you are so good at Greek. I love it. I heard it said this week that this word parakletos is like an omelet. It has everything in it, right? If you look at your different translations this morning, it's probably going to say something different. The ESV says helper. The New King James says comforter. The NIV says advocate. Like, what is it? Well, it's all of those. It's ham, sausage, and bacon and cheese in your omelet, right? It's the reality of the whole thing. In fact, parakletos, many have described it as one who comes alongside. Have you heard that? That the Holy Spirit is this one who comes alongside. And I think today we'll see that's pretty good, but I still think it's insufficient. Because this text tells us he doesn't just come alongside, he comes in. Right? He's just not alongside, he is in and a part of us. And this is the gift that God has given us. It's a gift that only believers get. That we will be enabled, listen, by this Spirit to seek out the love of God and to obey his commands. But as we participate in that, we will discover that God is truly with us. In fact, the end of these verses tells us that we will know God, that he will dwell in us, that he will be in us. This is astounding. But see the three dimensions. Because listen, at the beginning of this process, it is God by his Spirit that enables us, that opens our eyes, that softens our heart, that we might love him. It gives us the discipline and the wherewithal in order to obey his word. And then at the end of that, as we love him and obey him, we'll find his presence again. His presence is all throughout it. That's why it's like this weird three-dimensional matrix, right? It's not a linear progression of what I've got to do in order to get to that end. It's the reality that God has started it, and God ends it, and he's in it all together. You hearing it? And that would have been absolutely mind-blowing to the disciples. Jesus, and Jesus alone, has been God with them. But this is the promise of God in them. And we will discover what he has done through loving him and obeying his commands. So get this, and get that it's not a design left to chance, or left even for us to get it right. Notice the word will in this text. It shows up numerous times. Jesus will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, and therefore you